Thank you very much today to Sabrina Johnson for coming on board to do a beginner's guide to podcast interviews for PR. Spoiler, I have recently been working with Sabrina and I have learnt so much from her about how different it is to actually work with podcasts as opposed to traditional media channels. So hopefully today will be interesting for everybody. Sabrina's going to run through her presentation. If you have any questions, if that's okay, just hold on to them or put them in the chat. And this presentation will run for about half an hour and then we'll have half an hour for a discussion and a Q&A. So without further ado, Sabrina, if you'd like to go, that would be great. Cheers.
Lovely. So hello, everyone. Bit of information about me. And what I do. So I am actually a former PR. So I used to be like all of you, but based in London. And I've done some time in agency, I've done it in-house, I've done some time freelancing. But as you can see, life had other plans for me rather than just staying in PR. But the reason I bring that up because it is that I know exactly what you need when you're working with podcasts, what you're looking for, what you're trying to get out of it, and the questions and things you probably should be asking and doing. But yeah, life had other plans for me. 2020, lost my job just before the pandemic. Pandemic meant couldn't get a job. So took that redundancy money and just redesigned my life, which has actually ended up, I couldn't have predicted this myself really, over in Denmark, based remotely, and trying to develop a whole new industry in like podcast guest interviewing. So that's the background about me. Um, and then here, like as you've seen, what I do for a living is that I get experts and really interesting people onto podcasts. And here are just some examples of some of the people that I work with. I want to make it very clear I don't work for any one podcast. It's not that I work for a podcast and I bring people onto that podcast to interview. I'm actually the other way round. So think like almost like a radio day where you get loads of radio interviews in for a client. I'm a bit like that. I get you loads of podcast interviews for a client, except they don't all fall in one day. They're kind of like dotted out. And you can also see I'm not sector specific or industry specific. It might be my personality. I think as well as PR people, we can be quite flexible, but like I just like fascinating people, and if there's a story there, I will want to find it. So also given how small and new the industry is, well, new to the UK, I don't have to specialise in any one client either. So you can see the range here. It's B2B, like AI and change management. It's a ophthalmologist based in London. I've really learned how to spell ophthalmologist now, the amount of times I've had to write it. It could be a climate change expert, it could be a TV presenter. So there's lots of different types of people I've worked with. This slide here, I just want to use to show, like, it's the last one about me and my work, but it's to show the examples of podcasts that I've secured for clients. And I've deliberately included reach because I kind of just want you to have an idea of like the kind of podcasts that are out there. But at the same time as including reach, I will come to a later episode. It is extremely problematic to look at reach, and I'll explain why later. But what I do want you to see here is just the range of podcasts that are out there. I imagine you've probably never really heard of any of them, maybe one, but that's the point. That's how many podcasts that there are. But I'll come back to the issue around reach in a later slide. But for now, I'm going to sit and pause here and you sit with the amount of podcasts there are. Just how many podcasts are out there. This is it. So leaving you to like take that in for a moment, like I want you guys to understand that there's lots of questions I do get. Um, and one of the common ones could be something like in a group or in an email or via chat or something. Someone goes to me, "Hey, can you recommend any podcasts for my client in business? Any business podcasts?" And this is where I want you to get a feel for the world that I'm in. When someone says, "Can you recommend a couple of podcasts?" and my face screws up and I give some weird answer, this is why. Like, sure, Sophie, like, I can get you a couple of podcasts. It's only 8,400 in technology, kind of thing. I kind of want you to understand just when you ask recommendations, this is how big the space is. Globally, there's like almost 6 million. The US has half of them, so you've got to think about what region your client's interested in. And the UK is actually quite small fry, like about 250,000. But then again, while we're all here and thinking about podcasts, is that they have about 15 million listeners. I also want you all to to understand the broader the category, the more podcasts there are. So if you want a couple of news podcasts, sorry, Sophie, it's about 100,000 of them. Be more specific. Or like, I also want you to understand that there's so many niches. You can, even though you might be in, say, let's say society and culture, within there's 150 covering zoos. There's 200 covering prisons. There's like the niches are so small. I actually looked into water engineering for a client, and there's about 30 of them in the UK. So this is literally how big the space is. Um, and I think what's important to show, like, why we see the size of the space is because there are so many opportunities for PRs and their clients. And when you understand like how many podcasts there are and the type, that will then dictate like what your client can do on podcasts. And there's different things you can do. Yes, there's the obvious client guest interviews. So like obviously this is what this is where I specialize. But then God, like I'm sure we've all had that issue where don't think my client's quite right for a guest interview. He's a bit dry, or she doesn't really have anything to say. But there are so many other things that you could be doing. And there are, again, podcasts that don't have guests. So think about when you're sharing press releases, maybe it's relevant for a couple of podcasts because maybe you can send a press release to a podcast and then they might want to include the news in their discussions, their conversations. I'll pull out two examples. So, for example, like a consumer could be you are a champagne brand or you're representing a champagne brand and they've released their new line of like alcohol-free champagne, or maybe like you're a B2B brand, you're working for a B2B brand and they're in like med tech and they've released their new like ring for like measuring something or other. So think about product gifting, right? You're sending products out to journalists who may or may not be picking it up. Could you be saying to a couple of podcasts? They're not used to that. That's new to them. So could you be one of those brands that make a difference and you've shared, the new range of alcohol-free champagne for them? There's also product placement. Think about like those video podcasts, like where maybe like they're having conversations in the background. Maybe your client can pay or donate some free champagne to then be in the background of like while they're talking. I'd also think about, I think a really big one, particularly if you're in travel, press trips. A lot of travel PRs, and I've seen it all the time, like are struggling or going, my several journalists have just dropped out. Probably won't drop out a podcast because podcasts don't need to think about running it past their editor and will their editor approve it or not, because it might just be their decision, or maybe just the producer who loved the idea anyway. You've also got to think about if a podcast has dedicated an episode to your client for their press trip that's happening over there, it's probably going to happen because they've invested all that time and they've booked in. It's not likely to change unless maybe they've ended up in hospital or their kid's done something. But you've got to think about they're far less likely to drop out. I would also look at things like sponsorship. And then I'd also talk about, I mentioned say you have that client who's probably not great for interviews, but maybe you've got them through some like media training. And you know what pe media training trained people want after they've been media trained? Oh, can you get me some interviews now? And it's hard when maybe, Sky News aren't coming back about it. Ian King's not running anymore, and then, there maybe not be so many opportunities. Think about podcasts. You can probably find them some nice, small, comfortable podcasts to practice on. I wanted to bring this one up because, why should PRs consider it working with a podcast specialist? Because, like I was you all know how to pitch. Like, why bother considering a specialist when this is what you do for a living? So, like, I'm not here to like patronize and tell you how to pitch podcasts. Instead, what I want to do is help you adjust to this whole new world of podcasts and help manage expectations because they are a completely different beast. They don't work the way press do. And they probably, like, if you think about it again, these guys aren't professionals or doing this every day. So, some things I want to kind of highlight for you. The first one being it will probably most definitely cannibalize your time because you're not shifting like I have just to do podcasts. You have all your press work to do. You've got your account management to do. You've got all these different clients who are still expecting your PR work. But the amount of work that goes into podcasts, it will cannibalize it because I've just showed you the amount of podcasts that are out there. Like, I think, like, let's go for an example, say in sports. I looked it up before, like, coming on the call. There are almost globally 10,000 sports podcasts, right? And so even if you like go, well, let's just do UK, the UK market smaller, and let's make sure we focus on the ones that are active. That takes you down to about 700 podcasts. Do you have time to still look at 700 podcasts? Probably not. And then even if you cut it differently, right? Say we look at you've got an A-list international golfer, and let's find podcasts for him. Again, you're down to about 300. Do you have time to check all those 300? And checking comes to my point around regulation and due diligence. Because again, if you've got that A-list golfer, you're going to have to check the podcast for him. Do you have time to check 300 podcasts for your A-lister golfer? And you can't just send out a batch email to the 300 podcasts because they're all going to come back, or a lot of them come and go, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then you've got to turn them all down because you realize this one's done by a golfing fan and it's in his bedroom. And definitely your client won't appear on that one. This one only interviews like golfing coaches. This one even speaks to golfers based in the US, and you have to go and be there in order and record there, and your client's not going to travel to Minnesota, kind of thing. So, also when you think about due diligence, I mean, also on due diligence, there's no industry body for podcasts. They are not regulated. It is an absolute minefield. So while I'm spouting out all these different many podcasts out there, I check each and every one of them, all of them, before I put it in for a client. Because again, you can imagine the worst example would be politics, where you've got to check, is it a bunch of right wingers on there if your client's left wing? Doesn't make any sense. Again, you've got to not just check, the name sounds right, the description sounds right. You want to check, well, what kind of things are they talking about? I think it was with a client I discovered the term transgender trend because the client went, I can't appear on that. And I'm like, oh, they're talking about trans issues. That's great, right? No, no, Sabrina. It's the transgender trend where actually they are against people that are trans. I'm like, oh. So you see what I mean? You've got to check all these things because there's no industry body going, you can't run, you're discriminatory, you're this. You've got to check that for your client. I'd also say when it comes to podcasts, their workflow is entirely different. And the reason why I say that, again, most press are writing stories several times a day, every day, and their emails are right beside them whether they want it or not. Podcasts aren't like that. Not at all. Podcasts could be several times a week, weekly, monthly, when they feel like it. If you're a monthly, you only have to fill 12 slots. You could book that up quite quickly, actually. And you've got to think these guys aren't checking their emails every day. So while you have a deadline for your client, they don't. They don't at all. They will look at their emails when they feel like it. And also, they have other stuff going on. Again, the journalist is just pitching. No, you're just pitching a journalist who's at his desk every day writing stories for the one title. When it comes to podcasts, there are different types, right? You could have a podcast where it's actually the lead generator for their business. Recruitment is like massive for that. Or maybe it's because, it's a it's part of an add-on on their job that they, of all the other things they have to do. So quite a few legal podcasts are like that, where I run the podcast, sure, yeah, but it's in between all my client work I have to do as well. You've got to think about as well that so it's the lead generation, it's their part of their day job, it's their hobby. It's their passion, their hobby. They dip in it when they feel like it, and then they ignore it, and then they go on hiatus, and then they've gone on holiday, and then they've checked their emails maybe 3 months and gone, oh, this is a great idea. Yeah, I'd love to have this on as a guest when your client finished working with you about 3 months ago. Um, and also on that, I would say pitching podcasts just isn't the same. You're not you're not contacting another media professional. So half the words that might be in your pitch or the things you're referring to, they might not understand. Like if you're sending a press release and it's under embargo, are you sure they know what that even means? So you've got to think about as well, like who are you pitching? Because say in the medical industry, a lot of podcasts are run by doctors. Does a doctor understand half the communication terms you're on about? Or maybe you go to the doctor, oh, what's the reach of your podcast? And he comes back and goes, 200 downloads an episode. And then you're like, oh, my client won't appear on that. I have to turn around and expect that he doesn't think in the wholesome way that you actually need to in podcast, which is actually, yeah, it's 200 downloads per episode. Have you seen his Instagram? He's got 500,000. Like you need to be on that podcast. So pitching podcasts just isn't the same because you've got to think about they might understand what you're saying or what your requirements are. And you've got to think about who you're talking to because then while you have the medical doctor who'll be quite professional, then you've got Gary who runs his football podcast. So you don't want to be giving him all the research and the information and the boilerplate. He's going to go, do you have a football player for me or not? Oh, I want to talk to them, yeah, kind of thing. So to think about that. And then the last two, so I'll be on this slide for a while. Um, really good news for you. Podcasts can fill coverage gaps. So you might have that client where actually you got no results. They're threatening to leave you because you've got no results. And what they're giving you anyway is a couple of survey stories that no one wants to talk about. So the great thing about podcasts is a podcast for everything, as you saw. So there's probably a podcast for your client that will speak to them and it will probably excite them because people want to be interviewed. People love being interviewed. Like that's why I work with a lot of PRs. Like, oh, my client would love some podcasts. Can you get some? So it can fill coverage gaps for you. So there's less pressure on press. My final reason for considering someone like me is it's one thing listening to podcasts and enjoying podcasts. It's another thing pitching them. So while you've got all your work to do in press and PR, and you love press and PR, do you like pitching podcasts? Because if you don't, delegate it to somebody else, is what I'd recommend. And that brings me here, and I want to pause and let you have a look at this slide because these are all podcasts that are for founders. These are founder podcasts. So what I want you to see here is that when Sophie goes, Sabrina, can you send me a couple of business podcasts? Well, who's your client, Sophie? Like, have you seen what's out there? The thing I want every PR to understand is podcasts in the same category vary wildly. These are all just founder podcasts. And it's why I ask PRs to focus on relevant audiences over reach, right? Because sure, Megan's podcast is massive, but at the same time, who's your client? She might be one of the bigger ones, but does it make sense for your client? Do you make sense for her? Just think about that. At the same time, you know, look at how niche it goes into. I want you all to see every detail matters about your client. And it might seem weird or frustrating when you approach me and go, can you get some podcasts for my client? And I'm like, can you tell me about a bit about them? What's their race, religion, are they a parent? Do they have any kids? Where are they based? What's their industry in? Like, can you give me I want to dig into their lives. The reason why I want to dig into your client's life is because it really identifies a podcast that's for them and a podcast that isn't. There's nothing wrong. It's not about like patronizing or putting anyone down. There's nothing wrong with asking for podcast recommendations. Please do. But instead of saying, hi, can anyone recommend any founder podcast for my client? Turn it around. A better way to ask is maybe, can anyone recommend podcasts? I've got an A-lister client who's in fashion and they're a mum. Then someone will probably go, Mum Millionaire might work. And actually, there's fashion and founders. Yeah, that would be good. And who are they friends with? Who's in their circle? Or actually, I've seen she's been out with Megan a few times anyway. So that will probably work too. There you go. 1, 2, 3. There's 3 podcasts for you. The other thing I want to show here is don't just focus on podcasts you know. There's 6 million podcasts in the world. I'm rounding up. But I don't know if anyone recognizes any of the podcasts that are on here. You might recognize Megan's, but do you recognize any of the others? Probably not. And it's not a bad thing. Like there's nothing wrong. If your client's looking for new audiences, then it's probably good to find podcasts they haven't heard of but are bang on and relevant for them because that's how they'll reach new audiences. Um, and I also want you to think about, again, it speaks to due diligence. This is what you're checking for when you're going through the 300 podcasts you found in your client's category. You need to see, is it a fit for them? Because even just within here, there's so much variance. You can't just email the 20 people in this list for the same for the same type of client. You might have, bought a tech list from me, but then it doesn't make sense to keep pitching that same tech list for all your clients because it will vary. Man or woman, Asian or not, Muslim or not, are they a CEO or not? Are they based in Oxford or not? And then the other thing to look at when you're considering podcasts is how interesting is your client? If your client's boring, then maybe don't get them podcast interviews. Maybe it's better just to send a voucher over, send a free trial or free product over, send over your news. So this brings me to the slide I think everybody cares about the most, and it's the one I said I would come back to. And it's where I need to educate a lot of PRs and help you understand the space. The vast majority, and I'm talking on near on 90% of the 5.6 million podcasts globally, they have less than 1,000 listeners per episode. They're small. And the reason why reach is problematic is because there's no one way to measure audience reach for a podcast. There's no industry body, there's no one to complain to, there's no one verifying anything. And the other thing I want everyone to understand is that you can find figures, like I'm using a figure, an estimated reach of less than 1,000 listeners per episode. The system I use uses one type of reach. So I use it for me for consistency, and it's a useful guidance. That's what it is. It's a useful guidance. But I do need every PR in the world to know all platforms measure audience sizes differently, and they only do it for themselves. They're not sharing with each other. So yes, while, for example, the face yoga expert down in the corner publishes on Acast, Listen FM, Deezer, Spotify, Apple, they publish in different these places, and they also publish on YouTube. There's no figure that brings them all together and tells you this is the podcast's value. We have to use our common sense. So that's why when you take a look at all the podcast examples I've shared here, because according to my platform, these are all small podcasts. They're all tiny. They're small, tiny podcasts. And the reach figures you're seeing are not accounting for the points I've made at the bottom. Sure, the face yoga expert, like, it's an all right podcast, about 2,000, 3,000 listeners per episode. Yeah, great. I don't know if you can see it in the corner though, but actually, she has 500,000 listeners on YouTube. 500,000. Instagram, she has about 250,000, 240,000 on Instagram. That's pretty massive. But there's no one accounting or bringing that together. And the other thing you've got to think about is the different ways that everyone is measuring differently, right? Because there's listens, there's plays, there's a download, there's a clip. Like, who's bringing all of that together? And how do you define those different things? There's actually articles online explaining all the different ways. So it's very problematic. I also want to show with these at the bottom that reach doesn't reflect how good the podcast is for your client. It doesn't reflect the quality of listeners, who's listening, how credible it is, or how good the production is. According to most platforms, CNBC Executive Decisions is a tiny podcast with less than 500 listeners per episode. But guess what? It's produced by CNBC. Your client would probably be over the moon if they got a CNBC podcast. And then you look at who the quality of guests they're having. They're all Fortune 500, or actually they're the top end of the Fortune 500. So getting your client on there makes absolute sense. And again, to the point where there are some podcasts you probably will have heard of going, why is that in there? CBB's parenting, how is that? Are you sure that's 500? I don't know. I even don't know. I look at these videos and I'm not sure. The best way I can check and verify some of these things is, okay, what's the reach on Instagram? Oh, 330. Also, it's BBC. It's also very well produced because they have their own BBC studios, so people trust it. And then there'll be some where you'll never have heard of them, and you've got to really dig in again. It's due diligence, like dig in and scratch the surface. I remember coming across All Points West and being like, who's Carl? Never heard of him. It seems a bit vague. Let me just have a quick look at it. Turns out the man used to produce for the Sunday Times as a business journalist. And oh, look at the interviews he's had. Right, they're only massive UK companies. He only speaks to Screwfix. He only speaks to John Lewis. Okay, this is or is not a fit for my client. The last one there's actually two I want to flag as well. Gadget Detective is still probably to this date the worst designed artwork I've seen for a podcast ever. I'm like, did he get that from word art? Like, how did he produce that? What is it? But again, it's that due diligence. I was like, oh, would that be a nice, quick, easy win for my small client? So, oh, probably. Let me have a look. Turns out it's not, because this goes out on BBC Radio 1 with Eddie Nestor every week. And then it gets syndicated to talk radio. So actually it reaches millions. And then when I pitched, the guy called me back, went, oh yeah, exactly. And it was dealing with an actual media professional. I don't know what happened with it. I think he's trying to develop the brand separately and doing it himself. But again, these are things you can't judge. And then you look at Bloomberg, I'm like, why do they think that's 500 listeners per episode? But then I've got to think about, right, maybe the Bloomberg audience aren't listening on podcasts. They aren't necessarily listening to the Samsung podcast function or via Spotify or Apple, but you know where they all are? On Instagram. So it's when you guys think about things like that. And this brings me to my next point, which is probably again something that really matters to everybody listening. It's not like pitching the Times or the Financial Times, right? Where your client may be small, but the story's really good and it's hot on there and it's really related to something that's happening right now, and actually they'll come back. No, they won't. Doesn't matter how good your pitch is. If your guest does not suit, or whatever you're offering does not suit what that podcast is interested in, you've no chance of getting on. Well, I say no, let's say 98% chance of not getting on, because someone's going to prove me wrong, I'm sure. But you see here, these are some of the world's biggest podcasts. The left are the biggest in the UK, to the right, the biggest in the US. It doesn't matter how good your pitch is. You, unless your client reaches what they're looking for, what they need, you're not going to get onto these podcasts. And I'm going to say that with 99.9% certainty. And there's reasons for that. Number one, they've all got contact details. They're a black hole. They are. They have contact details. There's no one going in there looking for guests. Like, there isn't. You need to know who the producer is, have their specific email or whatever. There's no, don't, like, you might see the email address and maybe they do look at it to pull out certain things. They're not going through everything that comes in those inboxes because they're full. So how do these guys, say you do have an amazing client, you've got an A-lister, how do you get them on these podcasts? So that first point, they need to be an A-lister, a household name, a known political figure. They have to fit in with the guests who are the previous guests they've had on. If they don't, you're not going to get in. The other thing is, the other wild card is people have gone viral. If you've gone viral, they'll probably find you and they'll get you on. Or maybe you have your own podcast that has, or your client has their own podcast that does really, really well and is in the top end of podcasts. They will come and find you. And the other way they get them, and this is what matters actually when it comes to trying to build your client's profile, this is the only way you'll probably get any of your clients onto these podcasts. These massive, super massive podcasts, they all use a software. They use a software that identifies the best performing guests from other people's podcasts. They're ripping off guests. That's what they do. They find someone who's appeared somewhere, done really, really well, then they invite you on. That's how they do it. And the reason why, like, I know that is because I'm in groups, like I've been doing some networking. I'm in groups with all these producers. Like, I've got to meet the people who are either applying for these jobs, can do these jobs, or have worked. People who've worked with BBC, Wordery, Amazon. And I was like, how did you get onto these big podcasts? I'm like, Sabrina, they all use the software. That's how they do it. Now, this is an example of someone who went from no profile to a high profile. And I want to help you understand and help your clients understand what the journey looks like to get onto these big podcasts if you don't have a profile. And number one, it's long. It's a couple of years. This guy, he's like these person I use for explaining or training like people when it comes to podcasts. 10 years ago, he had no profile. Sure, he was a top-end law firm dealing with expensive divorces. I think he started with his own podcast for a bit. He had a couple of TV slots. But it actually wasn't until I don't think it was until he appeared on Soft White Underbelly, the one at the top, where I actually saw him for the first time 2 years ago. He went viral. And he went viral for all the reasons you'd think. He's like the media trainer's dream. He has the right talking points. He knows how to use his voice, like his anecdotes were great. He knew how to be relatable to everybody and he knew all the right, he's obviously clearly practiced at it and it's all nice and natural. He went viral. After he went viral, after that, he's not appeared on a single small podcast since. He's been on Diary of a CEO twice. He's been on all the top podcasts in the world. This man's probably been on them. So the key thing to share that was a 10-year journey he's been on. You can get on the podcast. Maybe you go viral. Maybe your client went viral last week and you're helping them out and all these podcasts want to find them, but that's rare. There are people that go viral and suddenly they're on massive podcasts, but then are they Do they have the ability to deal with these massive podcasts? Don't know. But that's the kind of, again, this generalization. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying the chances are very slim. So I'm going to stop talking for a bit actually, and I want to kind of hand over to you all. And based on the things that I've shared, how would you approach pitching an international entrepreneur who's never done podcasts before? Their media profile is literally a couple of trade comments. That's literally their profile. Does somebody want to put the answers in the chat, and then maybe Sophie, you can take a look for me because I can't see.
I certainly will. And just on a quick time check, it's 20 to 1. I know we're a bit late in starting. And apologies to the people who had trouble joining. We are recording it and we'll make sure you get that. Would anyone like to have a stab? And Angeline, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, says, you need to find out their backstory and how other people could relate to them.
Yeah, this one definitely. And
Anyone else?
what kind of podcast would you pitch for them? Or not pitch? Who would you not pitch for them? That's probably easier.
Well, before I saw this presentation, Sabrina, I would have, all the big business ones come to mind, don't they? But my answer to that, because no one else has answered yet, would be maybe going about a smaller one that's in their niche. Fee Johnson, again, hope I've pronounced that. Be really targeted in the pitch. So guess there's not many to pitch to. Keep it small.
Nice. So here, right, I'm wrapping up now. Here is how I would approach it. Absolutely. I think as the first person said, find out more about them, find out more information, get some examples of them speaking. Like if you don't know, if there's no broadcast profile for them, someone's going to Google their name and see what comes up. And if there's nothing, not sure. And who do they want to reach? So yeah, more about them, get some examples of them speaking, who they actually want to reach, and then build their profile from scratch. So I would definitely I'd phase it, maybe the first 6 months to a year. I mean, it's up to you. Like it depends on what the client's looking for and what they like and how picky they are. But with my clients, for the first 6 months, let's start on around between 500 and 1,500 listeners per episode. I'd pitch those first tier 3. Again, they need to be relevant. And I've put an example in here. This one has 500 listeners. So fireside with founders and leaders. That sounds nice and easy for them. And then maybe later down the line, then you'd look at, I'd say, tier 2. And I'm talking about tiers in terms of just reach, not like relevance and quality and all of that. Just reach. Here, maybe then have a look at, they're female, the Boston Heels. And they're actually looking now between 1 and 10,000 listeners per episode. So after they've been pretty practiced, there's a couple of videos out there about them now. Then move on to the ones that are slightly bigger. And then I think maybe when you're looking at 10 to 100,000, you're thinking about people who are higher profile. So maybe their brand's done actually quite well. So maybe who's the guy at Zipcar? The guy that I think Zipcar's gone now. The person that created Zipcar, I think he's probably built his profile enough and actually has the kind of right story to then go into 10 to 100K. The people I would absolutely avoid, don't even bother. Don't pitch the massive ones. If your client goes, can you get me on Diary of a CEO? A bit like asking, can you get me on the FT tomorrow? No. No, let's not even waste our time. So yeah, that's the presentation.
Thank you, Sabrina. That was absolutely brilliant. What a fantastic and engaging and hilarious speaker you are, except for all the times you kept using me as the bitchy client example. Please reassure everybody that I'm not actually like that in person.
It's not like that. It's easy to pick on you. But yeah, it's not about embarrassing anyone. I think it's just understanding how different the podcast world is. It just is completely different. And so allowing you guys to see and have an insight into when you ask a question, can you get a couple of podcasts? It makes it more obvious why it's not quite an appropriate question.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think you really brought that to life. It was so interesting, especially sort of, you know, even recently it's reminded me that you've got to look at more than just the followers that you can see on one platform. So as I said at the beginning of the presentation, if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat now. And yes, indeed, comments and positive feedback welcome, because obviously it's quite hard for Sabrina to do that presentation and we're all sort of muted and cameras off. So big thanks for that. I will kick off with a question. I am actually sitting in a member agency today and overheard a conversation this morning about podcasts with people who are certainly a lot younger than me. And they said that they only, or a number of people said they only tend to watch podcasts on, podcasts that have video. So I'm guessing on YouTube was the main platform. Have you got an opinion on this, Sabrina? If someone's never done a podcast before, would you put them straight into a video situation from a media training perspective? Have you got any thoughts on consumption of video versus audio only?
I don't have the stats to hand, but I did have this conversation with my little producer group where they themselves actually, when it comes to video podcasts, it is a new thing for the industry. They're noticing a growing trend of podcasts wanting to produce video. And actually, it's a challenge because the person that produces the video isn't the same person that produces audio, and they're having to skill up and everything to kind of merge all of that. And part of that conversation, it came out, I can't remember what it was. They were saying something like, oh, we're finding actually people on YouTube tend to be much older. Okay, I think it depends where they get the stats from. They are saying people on YouTube tend, maybe it's for a particular podcast. People on YouTube, this particular podcast, tend to be much older, around 50 to 60, listening on the weekends. I think it was a specific podcast. I was like, oh, that's fascinating. And they started thinking about, so actually this does or doesn't make sense for our audience. And I think from a PR standpoint, I guess it doesn't really matter whether it's for audio or video. You've got a podcast for your client. Well done. But I think for the client, when it comes to training, it depends on what you're training them for. If you want to train them to be appearing on video, I think you need to be doing a mix of pitching them for television and video, because the more examples you can give and more practice you can get them, the better, right? So the better your client performs, the better kind of opportunity that they can get. But I would also say, like, it's a practice skill set. So you're basically building. You need to consider your client, who they are. If they're quite dry on audio, they're probably going to be dry on video. So I think it's a media training thing. Media training comes in, like, the amazing about working with PRs, why I choose to work with PRs, is because your clients hugely are media trained. You understand what's required in their media training, because that makes a difference how they come across via audio or via video.
And that's something I've learnt from you as well, that being media trained is something podcast hosts are interested in, aren't they? Guests who have been media trained. So that's another thing to bear in mind. So much positive feedback on the chat. Jenny said, really useful, thank you. S. Deal, thanks Sabrina, very interesting insight. Steph Smith, thanks so much Sabrina, really interesting and useful. Lizzie, really insightful, thanks Sabrina. Lots of thanks and thanks, I'll hopefully export this chat. Kerry said, thank you for that insight and delivered with aplomb. Fee Johnson, looks like Fee could be somebody that you could connect with. Thanks Sabrina, really useful. And as a sometime podcast host, interesting to see the other side. So maybe you two could connect on that. Coralie says, thank you, super interesting. Listener wise, what level of audience insights can podcast hosts access/share?
So if you're a podcaster, that's a really good question actually, because I think they'll see what their platform gives them, but they won't think necessarily beyond that. Again, they're not communications people usually. If you're the person with your sports podcast and it's done really well, then you'll be like, oh, I'm working with another podcast where they're a history podcast, and the stats they quote is their Instagram, because it's the biggest one. Oh, we have over 50, I think it was over 50,000 people on Instagram. and that's what they use. They tend to go the one that's bigger. But I think that then lends to the point. And it's same with producers as well, actually, because again, it's really interesting hearing the other side when producers are complaining at me. Producers and podcast hosts don't understand PRs. They don't know what you're looking for, what you care about, and they'll pull out something and send it over and not think much of it. Oh, it's 200 downloads. Well, what does that mean? 200 downloads where? 200 downloads what? Or they might be like, well, we know it's 200, but do they understand? Like, are they asking me for listens? Are they asking me for who like, they don't know what you're asking for. So again, it's sort of about being pronounced about what you think you're asking for, or actually, like the way I do, I don't tend to ask podcasts their reach because I don't think they really know. If you are Diary of a CEO, they have a whole team, so they know all this stuff and they're really nuanced and deep down into the weeds, and they really understand their listeners to the nth degree. They know when their listeners are really into Greg's because of A, B, C, D, and E. But if you don't have that level of money, like I expect they don't know, and I just figure it out for myself and explain to the client. I wouldn't really.
I think some. So also as a podcast host who hasn't done it since I had my baby 2 years ago. So, but I use a platform called maybe it's Buzzsprout, and it does tell you the downloads across the different platforms. So for the sake of looking for sponsorship and stuff, I would just add all of those things up. But I think what you're saying, Sabrina, is you need to really ask the right questions in terms of the granularity as the PR for the reach, because they don't know. Coralie's got another question. Is there anything that is particularly helpful when considering the client's personal brand in relation to the attractiveness of them as a guest? Hope this makes sense. Feel free to unmute yourself, Coralie, if
No, I
I've
think
not
I kind of
represented.
get it. So, because I do, like when I've worked with PRs, I'll be like, can you tell me about their personal life? This might seem a bit weird for them, but I'm going to dig into their life to find out what I can get. It is because, but I was working with one client where she was co-founder of a customer loyalty technology service, like proper SaaS. And the stuff I was selling into podcasts is she's built the business with her husband, and actually she has no SaaS background at all. This is where she's learnt everything. She was previously a journalist, and she comes from a family of beekeepers. And people are like, wow, oh, she's fascinating. Yeah, we'd love to have her on. Like, yes, it depends on the podcast as well. Yes, selling your client's expertise and what they could talk about. But I think I learned it from a BBC producer actually, when like I was always pitching in radio and television. And he was like, we need to see the human behind whatever the service is. Yes, we'll promote the service, it will come up in conversation, it will, but if you're going to have someone talking, think about the length of podcasts between 20 and 45 minutes. Some of these go on for an hour. They need to be able to keep going for an hour. Then you need to keep you listening for an hour. So it's whatever you can bring in to kind of keep it alive in people's minds and the anecdotes. I mean, what brought them here, right? I shared, me living in Danish countryside because that kind of adds to my story, kind of thing. And someone's probably sitting there going, why did you pick Denmark? Like, why there? And it helps for me also like build contacts and stuff. And I'm helping my clients understand people aren't just that people don't want to hear you sell your product or service. They want to buy into you. They want to hear about you. If there's something that they relate to about you, they're probably more likely to work with you. I also explained to like as a guy I was working with, I took him on as a financial coach, and I was like, "Oh, I heard your podcast 3 years ago, from 3 years ago, and I really liked it actually. And can we work together?" He's like, "What? 3 years ago? Yeah, I remember you said, how you burnt out and blah blah, and the stuff you're going through, and I really I really understood that." It's like, oh, okay. But I mean, people pick out stuff. So that's why I would say personal stuff matters. I would say again, find out your client's comfort level though. They don't have to reveal the world. They don't have to talk about, their divorce last week. They don't have to talk about that. It's just what are the things they're comfortable sharing that can help grow their story and their brand.
Okay, brilliant. Has anybody got any more questions for Sabrina? I don't think so. Great. Well, thank you so much, Sabrina. It was absolutely brilliant to see you today, and that was a really enlightening presentation. If anybody wants to contact Sabrina directly, you've got her details on screen there. If anyone wants to contact me directly, I am Northwest based. I'll come and meet anyone for a coffee. Follow the LinkedIn page, and hopefully that was really useful for you all. I can see that it was from the comments. So big round of applause for Sabrina. And if that's all, guys, I will close the meeting now and see you all very soon. Take care. Thank you. Thanks, Coralie. Thanks, Avril. Bye-bye.